The Winchester sun dipped behind the jagged horizon as Lillian Grace stood at the edge of her father's property, the weight of his words still crushing her chest. "You're nothing but a burden, girl, always have been." She clutched the small bundle of belongings tighter to her chest, tears threatening but refused permission to fall. At 19, she'd endured his cruelty for as long as she could remember, but today was different. Today she was leaving Montana Territory, 1876. The land was as unforgiving as its inhabitants, but somewhere beyond these rolling hills and vast plains lay a future that didn't include her father's drunken rages or calloused fists. Lillian took one last look at the dilapidated cabin that had never truly been a home before turning toward the town of Silver Creek. The 2-mile walk gave her time to contemplate her rashness. She had exactly $3.42 to her name, sewn carefully into the hem of her dress. Not enough for a stagecoach ticket, barely enough for a few meals. But she had her mother's silver locket around her neck, and more importantly, her mother's skills with a needle and thread. Someone in town would need a seamstress. They had to. Silver Creek appeared before her as the last light faded from the sky, its main street already alive with the sounds of piano music drifting from the saloon and the occasional burst of raucous laughter. Lillian pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and quickened her pace. A young woman alone at this hour invited trouble, and trouble was what she was running from. The general store was closed, its windows dark. Mrs. Peterson, the owner's wife, had always been kind to Lillian when she came to town for supplies. Perhaps she could offer advice or even work. But that would have to wait until morning. For now, Lillian needed somewhere to spend the night. The Silver Dollar Hotel stood at the far end of town, its painted sign faded but still legible in the light of the street lamps. It wasn't fancy, but it was respectable enough. Lillian hesitated outside, counting the coins in her palm one more time before pushing through the door. The lobby was empty save for an older man behind the counter, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose as he studied a ledger. He looked up at the sound of the bell above the door, his expression shifting from boredom to concern when he saw Lillian. "Evening, miss. You lost." Lillian straightened her spine and approached the counter. "No, sir, I need a room for the night. Your cheapest, please." The man's bushy eyebrows rose. "Cheapest is still 50 cents. You got that?" She nodded, though the price made her stomach clench. That was nearly a sixth of everything she had. "Just yourself?" he asked, his tone suggesting he didn't entirely believe her. "Yes, sir." He studied her a moment longer before turning the ledger around. "Sign here. Rooms at the top of the stairs, first door on your right. Name's Walter if you need anything." Lillian scrawled her name in the book and handed over the coins, thanking him before climbing the narrow staircase. The room was small but clean, with a single bed, washstand, and chair. She set her bundle on the bed and sank down beside it, the events of the day finally catching up to her. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "Just like your mother, you are nothing but pretty words and disappointment." The familiar ache of missing her mother swelled in her chest. 5 years gone, taken by a fever that swept through the territory, leaving Lillian alone with a man who'd never wanted the burden of a daughter. Morning came too quickly, the sunlight streaming through the thin curtains rousing Lillian from a fitful sleep. She washed her face in the basin, pinned her honey-brown hair back neatly, and smoothed the wrinkles from her best dress, the one she'd made herself from fabric scraps over the course of a year. Today she would find work. The general store was her first stop. Mrs. Peterson was indeed sympathetic but had no work to offer. "Times are hard, dear," she said, patting Lillian's hand. "But the Silver Creek Gazette just put up a notice. They're looking for someone to help with the laundry at the boarding house. It's not fancy work, but it's honest." The boarding house sat on a side street, a large 2-story building with a wide porch. A sign in the window confirmed they were hiring, and Lillian felt a flicker of hope as she knocked on the door. A harried-looking woman answered, flour dusting her apron. "Help's round the back," she said briskly before Lillian could speak. "Actually, madam, I'm here about the laundry position." The woman looked her up and down. "You ever done laundry for 20 men before?" "No, madam, but I learn quickly and I'm not afraid of hard work." Something in Lillian's earnest expression must have convinced her. $3 a week, room and board included. You get Sundays off. Start tomorrow at dawn. She turned away, then paused. I'm Mrs. Holloway. What's your name, girl? Lillian Grace, madam. Well, Lillian Grace, don't be late. The men like their shirts ready by noon. Relief flooded through her. She had a job and a place to stay. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Lillian turned to leave, a commotion in the street caught her attention. A group of riders was coming into town, their horses kicking up dust. At their head was a man on a buckskin stallion, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his posture easy in the saddle. Even from a distance, she could see the confident set of his shoulders, the way the other riders deferred to him. Mrs. Holloway appeared beside her. That's the Mackenzie outfit, she said, a note of respect in her voice. They run cattle on the North Range. That's Kade Mackenzie in front, owns the biggest spread this side of the Bitterroot Mountains. Lillian watched as the riders dismounted in front of the saloon, their spurs jingling. The man called Kade Mackenzie moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in his own skin. He said something that made the others laugh, then glanced up, his gaze sweeping the street until it landed briefly on her. Even from a distance, the intensity of that look sent a shiver down her spine. Then he turned away, following his men into the saloon, and the moment was gone. They'll be staying here, Mrs. Holloway said, misinterpreting Lillian's interest. They always do when they come to town. Extra work for you, I'm afraid. Lillian nodded absently, her thoughts elsewhere. She had no business noticing men like Kade Mackenzie. Men like that weren't for girls like her, girls with nothing to offer but the clothes on their backs and a determination not to break. The boarding house room was small but private, tucked under the eaves on the third floor. Mrs. Holloway showed her to it that evening, explaining that since Lillian would be living in, she could start right away with the evening meal. Kitchen's down there, she said, pointing down the narrow hallway. Dining room's off to the right. We serve at 6 sharp. Don't be late. The kitchen was hot and chaotic, with a large woman named Bertha kneading dough at a scarred wooden table while pots bubbled on the massive iron stove. You the new girl? Bertha asked, not looking up from her work. Yes, madam, Lillian Grace. Good, you can chop those onions. Then set the tables. 20 places tonight. For the next hour, Lillian worked steadily, chopping vegetables, setting tables, and trying to stay out of Bertha's way. By the time 6 o'clock approached, her arms ached and her eyes stung from the onions, but the dining room was ready, the tables set with mismatched plates and cutlery. The thundering of boots on the porch signaled the arrival of the boarders. Lillian smoothed her apron and took a deep breath as the door swung open and men began filing in. Most were locals, miners, shopkeepers, a few ranch hands, but among them were the men from the Mackenzie outfit, their clothes dusty from the trail. And then there was Kade Mackenzie himself, ducking slightly to enter the doorway. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared from a distance. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hair curled slightly where it brushed his collar, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, visible through the stubble. He nodded politely to Mrs. Holloway, then scanned the room until his gaze fell on Lillian. For a moment he simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, just a slight upward tilt of his lips, and moved to take his seat with his men. Lillian busied herself with serving the meal, careful not to spill as she ladled stew into bowls. When she reached Kade Mackenzie, he looked up at her again. Thank you, miss, he said, his voice deep and quiet. You're welcome, Mr. Mackenzie. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. You know my name. Everyone in Silver Creek knows the Mackenzie name, sir. He studied her for a moment longer. But you're new here. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes, sir, just started today. One of his men called for his attention, and Lillian moved on to the next bowl, aware of a strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. It was foolishness, she told herself firmly. She had more important things to worry about than the way Kade Mackenzie's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. Later, as she cleared the tables and carried stacks of dishes to the kitchen, she overheard snippets of conversation. The Mackenzie outfit had come to town for supplies and to deposit money at the bank. They'd be staying a few days before heading back to the ranch. "New girl's pretty," one of the ranch hands commented, not bothering to lower his voice as Lillian passed. "Mind your manners, Jenkins," Kade replied, his tone mild but with an undercurrent of steel. "The lady deserves your respect." Lillian felt her cheeks warm as she hurried back to the kitchen. Lady. No one had ever called her that before. The evening finally wound down, the boarders retiring to their rooms or heading back out to the saloon. Lillian's arms ached from carrying dishes, and her feet throbbed in her worn boots. But as she climbed the narrow stairs to her room, a sense of accomplishment filled her. She had survived her first day. Morning came too early, the rooster's crow barely preceding Mrs. Holloway's sharp rap on her door. "Up and at 'em, girl, breakfast won't cook itself." The day passed in a blur of tasks, helping with breakfast, stripping beds, hauling water, and finally the laundry. The wash house behind the boarding house was stifling, steam rising from the copper tubs as Lillian scrubbed shirts against the washboard until her knuckles were raw. She was hanging the last of the shirts on the line when a shadow fell across her work. Turning, she found Kade Mackenzie standing a few feet away, his hat in his hands. "Miss Grace," he said, nodding politely. Lillian wiped her damp hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "Mr. Mackenzie, can I help you with something?" "Just wanted to check if my shirts would be ready before we head out tomorrow." He gestured to the line where several shirts were already drying in the afternoon sun. "Yes, sir, they'll be pressed and ready by morning." He nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, he glanced around the wash house, taking in the steaming tubs and piles of wet linens. "Hard work." "I don't mind it," she said, though her aching back suggested otherwise. His gaze returned to her face, searching. "You're not from around here?" "No, sir." "My father's place is a few miles outside town, but you're staying here now." It wasn't a question, but something in his tone made her want to explain. It seemed time for a change. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded as if she'd confirmed something. "Well, Miss Grace, I won't keep you from your work. Thank you for the attention to our laundry." As he turned to go, Lillian found herself calling after him. "Mr. Mackenzie," he paused, looking back. How did you know my name?" A small smile curved his lips. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned it. Said you were new but a hard worker. Seems she was right." With that, he settled his hat back on his head and strode away, leaving Lillian to wonder why such a simple exchange had left her heart beating so rapidly. The next morning, Lillian rose before dawn to press the shirts for the Mackenzie outfit. She took extra care with each one, her needle flashing in the lamplight as she repaired a loose button here, a small tear there. By the time the men came down for breakfast, their clothes were neatly folded and waiting in their rooms. She was serving coffee when Kade entered the dining room, wearing one of the shirts she'd mended. He caught her eye and nodded his thanks, a gesture she acknowledged with a small smile before continuing her rounds. Breakfast was a rushed affair, the Mackenzie men eager to be on the trail. Lillian was clearing plates when she overheard Kade speaking to Mrs. Holloway. "We'll be back through in about a month," he was saying. "Would appreciate if you'd hold our usual rooms." "Of course, Mr. Mackenzie. Always a pleasure having you and your boys." Lillian didn't realize she was staring until Kade looked up and caught her eye. She quickly looked away, embarrassed to be caught eavesdropping, but not before she saw the corner of his mouth lift in that now familiar half-smile. Later, as she watched from the porch while the Mackenzie outfit rode out of town, Lillian tried to dismiss the odd feeling of disappointment settling in her chest. It was ridiculous to feel anything at all about the departure of a man she'd barely spoken to. Yet as the days passed, and she settled into the rhythm of life at the boarding house, she found her thoughts straying to Kade Mackenzie more often than she cared to admit. There was something about him, a quiet strength, an integrity that seemed rare in a world where Lillian had learned to expect the worst from people. 2 weeks after her arrival in Silver Creek, Lillian had her first day off. She used part of her earnings to purchase a length of calico from the general store, planning to make herself a new dress. As she left the store, a familiar figure caught her eye across the street, Her father was stumbling out of the saloon, clearly drunk despite the early hour. Lillian froze, clutching her package to her chest as he weaved his way down the boardwalk. If he saw her, there was no telling what he might do. She ducked into the alley beside the general store, heart pounding as she waited for him to pass. But instead of continuing down the street, he stopped, peering into the window of the store she had just left. "Seen my girl?" she heard him asking someone. "Lillian, 'bout this tall, brown hair, ran off couple weeks back. Haven't seen her," came the reply, and Lillian recognized the voice of Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper. "You're lying," her father slurred. "She's been here, I know it." "Move along, Grace," Mr. Peterson said firmly. "You're drunk." There was a scuffling sound, and Lillian peered cautiously around the corner to see her father grabbing Mr. Peterson by the lapels. "Don't tell me what to do," he snarled. "That girl's mine, and I mean to find her." Before Lillian could decide what to do, the sheriff appeared, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Problem here, gentlemen," her father released Mr. Peterson with a shove. "No problem. Just looking for my daughter. She ran off." "Well, you won't find her by roughing up storekeepers," the sheriff said. "Why don't you head on home, sleep it off?" For a moment, Lillian thought her father might argue, but then he spat on the ground and turned away, muttering curses as he staggered back toward the saloon. Lillian pressed herself against the wall of the alley, suddenly cold despite the warm day. She'd known her father would be angry when he discovered her gone, but she hadn't expected him to come looking for her in town. The thought of being dragged back to that cabin made her stomach clench with fear. She waited until she was certain he was gone before slipping out of the alley and hurrying back to the boarding house, constantly glancing over her shoulder. The sanctuary of her room felt less secure now, knowing her father was in town, searching for her. That evening, as she helped serve dinner, Lillian was quieter than usual, her mind preoccupied with worry. She jumped when Mrs. Holloway touched her arm. "You feeling all right, girl? You look pale." "I'm fine, thank you, madam. Just a little tired, Mrs." Holloway didn't look convinced, but she nodded. "Well, finish up here and get some rest. Can't have you getting sick on me." Lillian managed a smile and continued her work, but her unease persisted. As she cleared the last of the dishes, she heard the front door open and froze, terrified it might be her father. Instead, the sheriff stepped into the dining room, removing his hat as he nodded to Mrs. Holloway. "Evening, madam. Sorry to disturb your dinner hour, but I'm looking for Lillian Grace." Lillian's hands tightened on the stack of plates she was holding. Mrs. Holloway glanced at her, then back at the sheriff. "She works for me, has done for 2 weeks now. Is there a problem, sheriff?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "Her father's in town, making quite a fuss. Says she ran away, that she's only 16 and he wants her back home." 16? Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows rose as she looked at Lillian. "Is that true?" Lillian set down the plates carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "No, madam, I'm 19. My mother's Bible has the date of my birth written in it." She turned to the sheriff. "My father is not a kind man, sheriff. I left because I couldn't bear it anymore." The sheriff studied her, his expression softening slightly. "I figured as much." "Hiram Grace has never been what you'd call a model citizen," he sighed. "Still, if you're underage, I'd have to take you back to him." "I'm not," Lillian said firmly. "I can prove it if I need to." "That won't be necessary," came a new voice from the doorway. Lillian turned to find Kade Mackenzie standing there, trail dust still on his clothes, as if he'd ridden hard to get back to town. Her heart gave a strange little leap at the sight of him. "Mr. Mackenzie," the sheriff acknowledged with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Change of plans," Kade said, stepping into the room. His eyes found Lillian's, holding her gaze for a moment before returning to the sheriff. "I couldn't help overhearing. Hiram Grace is claiming his daughter is underage." "That's right." "Well, he's lying," Kade said flatly. "I remember when Sarah Grace had her baby. Would have been in 57. I was just a boy, but I recall my mother taking food over to their place after the birth. If Miss Grace was born in 57, she's 19 now." Lillian stared at him in astonishment. How could he possibly know that? The sheriff looked relieved. "That settles it then. I'll tell Hiram to leave you be, Miss Grace." He settled his hat back on his head. "Evening, folks." After he left, Mrs. Holloway excused herself to check on something in the kitchen, leaving Lillian alone with Kade. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but how did you know when I was born?" Kade's expression was difficult to read. "My family's ranch borders your father's property. Our families knew each other a long time ago." He hesitated. "Your mother was a good woman. She didn't deserve what happened to her." The mention of her mother brought a lump to Lillian's throat. "No, she didn't. Neither do you." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that went beyond the few words they'd exchanged. "You came back early," Lillian said, changing the subject. "Mrs. Holloway wasn't expecting you for another 2 weeks." A faint smile touched his lips. "Like I said, change of plans." He glanced toward the kitchen door. "I should let you get back to work. I just wanted to make sure everything was all right." As he turned to go, Lillian found herself calling after him again. "Mr. Mackenzie," he paused, looking back at her. "Thank you for what you did." His expression softened. "Get some rest, Miss Grace. You look tired." With that, he was gone, leaving Lillian to wonder once again about the enigmatic rancher who seemed to appear just when she needed help. The next morning, Lillian was in the wash house when Mrs. Holloway found her. "Mackenzie wants to see you," she said, her tone suggesting she didn't entirely approve. "He's in the parlor." Lillian wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly nervous. "Did he say why?" "No, and I didn't ask." "He pays good money to stay here, so if he wants to talk to my laundress, I'm not going to stop him." She gave Lillian a sharp look. "But mind yourself, girl. Kade Mackenzie is a good man, but he's still a man." "Yes, madam," Lillian murmured, removing her apron and smoothing her hair before making her way to the parlor. Kade was standing by the window, looking out at the street. He turned when she entered, his expression serious. "Miss Grace, thank you for coming. Mrs. Holloway said you wanted to see me." He nodded, gesturing for her to sit. Lillian perched on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap while Kade remained standing. "I wanted to warn you," he said without preamble. "Your father's still in town, and he's been telling anyone who will listen that you stole from him before you left." Lillian felt the blood drain from her face. "That's not true." "I know it isn't," Kade said, "but he's convincing when he wants to be, especially with people who don't know him well. He's saying you took money that was meant for taxes on his land." "The only money I have is what I earned myself, sewing for neighbors," Lillian said, her voice shaking slightly with indignation. "I would never steal." Kade's expression softened. "I believe you. But your father is determined to cause trouble. The sheriff's doing what he can to keep him in line, but I thought you should know to be careful." Lillian nodded, her mind racing. "Thank you for telling me. There's something else." Kade hesitated, then sat down in the chair opposite hers. "I'm heading back to my ranch tomorrow. I'd like you to come with me." Lillian stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "I beg your pardon. My housekeeper, Mrs. Donnelly, is getting on in years. She could use help with the cooking and cleaning. The pay would be better than what you're making here, and you'd have your own room in the main house." His eyes held her steadily. "You'd be safe there. Your father wouldn't dare come onto Mackenzie land." For a moment, Lillian couldn't find words. The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that she hardly knew how to respond. "Why would you do this for me?" she finally asked. "You barely know me." Something flickered in Kade's eyes, a shadow of some old pain. "I knew your mother," he said quietly. "She was kind to me once when I needed it." "Consider it repaying a debt." Lillian studied him, trying to understand what he wasn't saying. There was clearly more to the story, but she sensed he wouldn't elaborate further. "I have a position here," she said slowly. "Mrs. Holloway took a chance on me. She'll find another girl," Kade said. "And if your father's spreading rumors about you stealing from him, it might get harder for you to stay in town. People talk." He was right, and the thought sent a chill through her. If her father convinced enough people that she was a thief, she might find herself without work or a place to stay. "I'll need to think about it," she said finally. Kade nodded, rising to his feet. "Of course, we leave at first light tomorrow. You can let me know your decision before then." After he left, Lillian returned to the wash house, her mind in turmoil. The offer was tempting better pay, more comfortable lodgings, and most importantly, safety from her father's reach. But it would mean leaving the independence she'd just begun to establish, placing her trust in a man she barely knew. Yet there was something about Kade Mackenzie that made her want to trust him. The way he'd stepped in to help her with the sheriff, the respect he showed to everyone around him, from Mrs. Holloway down to the stable boys. And there was that connection to her mother, a debt he felt he owed, though she couldn't imagine what it might be. By evening, Lillian had made her decision. She found Kade in the dining room after the other boarders had retired, sitting alone with a cup of coffee. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, approaching his table, "I've been thinking about your offer." He gestured for her to sit, his expression giving nothing away. "And I'd like to accept if the position is still available." Relief flickered across his face so briefly she almost missed it. "It is." "We'll leave at dawn." He studied her for a moment. "You won't regret this, Miss Grace, I promise you that." As she packed her meager belongings that night, Lillian wondered if she was making the right choice. But when she closed her eyes, she could still hear her father's slurred voice asking after her in town, still feel the cold fear that had gripped her at the thought of being dragged back to his cabin. Whatever awaited her at the Mackenzie ranch, it had to be better than that. Dawn found Lillian standing on the porch of the boarding house, her bundle at her feet as she waited for Kade. Mrs. Holloway had been surprisingly understanding when Lillian explained she was leaving. "Can't say I blame you with your father causing trouble," the older woman had said. "Mackenzie's a fair employer, you could do worse." The clip-clop of hooves announced Kade's arrival. He rode up to the boarding house leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with a white blaze on her forehead. "Morning, Miss Grace," he said, dismounting. "Ready to go?" Lillian nodded, eyeing the mare nervously. "I should tell you I've never ridden before." Kade's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. "Daisy here is as gentle as they come. She'll take good care of you." He helped her mount, his hands strong and sure as he lifted her into the saddle. Lillian gripped the pommel tightly, feeling precarious despite Kade's reassurances. "Relax," he said, adjusting the stirrups for her. "Daisy can sense if you're nervous. Just sit back and let her do the work." It took several miles before Lillian began to feel comfortable in the saddle. By midday, when they stopped to rest the horses and eat the lunch Mrs. Holloway had packed for them, she was almost enjoying the ride. "You're a natural," Kade commented as he helped her dismount. "Most first-time riders are complaining of sore backsides by now." Lillian smiled, stretching her legs. "I didn't say I wasn't sore, I'm just too proud to complain." He laughed at that, a rich, warm sound that made her smile widen. It was the first time she'd heard him truly laugh, and she decided she liked the sound. They ate sitting on a fallen log beside a small creek, the horses grazing nearby. The day was warm, the sky a clear, endless blue above them. In the distance, mountains rose in jagged peaks, still capped with snow despite the summer heat. "It's beautiful here," Lillian said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Kade nodded, his gaze following hers to the mountains. "Best country in the world, if you ask me. Tough but honest, a man knows where he stands." "And a woman?" Lillian asked, curious. He glanced at her, a smile tugging at his lips. "Same goes for a woman, I expect, though I can't claim to know much about that side of things." "No wife waiting for you at the ranch?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and Lillian immediately wished she could take it back. It was far too personal, but Kade didn't seem offended. "No wife," he said simply. "Never found the time for courting, I suppose." There was something in his tone that suggested there was more to the story, but Lillian didn't press. She was already embarrassed by her forwardness. They mounted up again after lunch, continuing their journey as the sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. Kade pointed out landmarks along the way, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, a stand of aspen trees where he'd shot his first deer as a boy, the distant outline of what would one day be a new railroad line. By late afternoon, they crested a rise and Kade reined in his horse. "There it is," he said, pointing. "Mackenzie Ranch." Lillian caught her breath at the sight. Below them, a broad valley spread out, bisected by a meandering river. Fields of grass rippled in the breeze, dotted with cattle. And nestled against the base of a hill stood a large house, not a mansion by any means, but substantially larger and more impressive than any dwelling Lillian had ever seen in these parts. Made of sturdy logs with a stone chimney, It spoke of permanence, of roots sunk deep into the Montana soil. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Kade was watching her reaction, a hint of pride in his expression. "My father built that house with his own hands, starting with just a one-room cabin. Added on as the ranch grew. By the time he passed, it was what you see now." "How long has your family been here?" "Since '46. My father was one of the first settlers in this valley." He smiled slightly. "He always said he looked at this land and knew he was home." They rode down into the valley, passing fenced pastures where horses grazed. Several outbuildings clustered near the main house, a barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and what looked like a blacksmith shop. As they approached, a dog came bounding out to meet them, barking joyfully. "That's Bear," Kade said. "Don't worry, he's friendly." A woman appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She was in her 60s, Lillian guessed, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You're back early," she called as Kade dismounted. "And you've brought company, Mrs. Donnelly. This is Lillian Grace," Kade said, helping Lillian down from her horse. "She'll be helping you with the house." Mrs. Donnelly looked Lillian up and down, her expression unreadable. "Well, it's about time. I've been telling him for years I can't manage this place alone anymore." She nodded briskly. "Come on in, girl. You look done in. I'll show you your room and then you can wash up for supper." Lillian glanced at Kade, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Go on, I'll take care of the horses," following Mrs. Donnelly into the house. Lillian was struck by the simple elegance of the place. The furniture was sturdy and well made, the floors polished wood covered here and there with colorful rugs. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, with comfortable chairs arranged around it. "This way, Mrs. Donnelly said, leading her up a staircase. "Your room's at the end of the hall. Used to be Mr. Mackenzie's sister's room before she married and moved to California." The room was small but pleasant, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the valley. A colorful quilt covered the bed and curtains of the same fabric framed the window. "Bathrooms down the hall," Mrs. Donnelly continued. "We've got indoor plumbing. Mr. Mackenzie insisted on it when they added this wing 5 years back. Quite the modern convenience." She eyed Lillian critically. "You ever worked in a house this size before?" "No, madam, but I'm a quick learner." Well, we'll see. Supper's at 6 sharp. Don't be late. Mr. Mackenzie doesn't like to be kept waiting." With that, she left Lillian alone to unpack her few belongings and wash away the dust of the journey. The water in the basin was cool and refreshing, and as Lillian changed into her cleanest dress, she found herself wondering again about the strange turn her life had taken. A week ago, she'd been scrubbing laundry at a boarding house, trying to avoid her father's notice. Now she was in this beautiful house, miles from Silver Creek, employed by a man who seemed determined to protect her for reasons she still didn't fully understand. Supper was a quiet affair, just the three of them seated around a large oak table in the dining room. The food was simple but plentiful: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Mrs. Donnelly was a good cook, though she brushed off Kade's compliments with a gruff, "It's just food." After the meal, Kade excused himself to check on something in the barn, leaving Lillian to help Mrs. Donnelly with the dishes. "He's a good man," the older woman said abruptly as they worked side by side at the sink. "Best I've ever known." Lillian glanced at her, surprised by the sudden declaration. "He seems to be," she agreed cautiously. Mrs. Donnelly snorted. "You don't need to be careful with me, girl. I've been with the Mackenzie family since Kade was in short pants. I know him better than he knows himself sometimes." She handed Lillian a plate to dry. "He doesn't bring people here unless he's got a good reason, so what's yours?" The directness of the question caught Lillian off guard. "I'm not sure I understand. Why did he bring you here? And don't tell me it's just because I need help." "That's been true for years, and he's never brought anyone before." Lillian hesitated, then decided on honesty. "My father, he's not a good man. Mr. Mackenzie offered me a position here after my father started causing trouble for me in town." Mrs. Donnelly's expression softened slightly. That sounds like Kade, always trying to save someone." She eyed Lillian thoughtfully. "Just remember, girl, this is a respectable house. Whatever you might be thinking about Mr. Mackenzie, he's your employer, nothing more. Lillian felt her cheeks warm. I wasn't thinking anything inappropriate, Mrs. Donnelly. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to work here, that's all. The older woman studied her a moment longer, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good, now let me show you where everything goes, and tomorrow we'll start on your duties proper. The next few days passed in a blur of new routines and responsibilities. Lillian rose early each morning to help Mrs. Donnelly prepare breakfast for Kade and the ranch hands who came in from the bunkhouse. After the men left for their day's work, there were rooms to clean, linens to wash, bread to bake, and 100 other tasks that kept the household running smoothly. It was hard work, but Lillian didn't mind. There was satisfaction in seeing the house gleaming under her care, in learning Mrs. Donnelly's recipes and techniques. And always, at the back of her mind, was the knowledge that she was safe here, far from her father's reach. Kade himself was often absent during the day, riding out with his men to check on cattle, mend fences, or attend to the myriad tasks that came with running a large ranch. But he was always present at mealtimes, his quiet appreciation for the food they prepared a reward in itself. Sometimes in the evenings, he would invite Lillian to join him on the porch after supper. They would sit in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. Occasionally, he would point out a hawk circling overhead or tell her stories about the early days of the ranch. Lillian found herself looking forward to these quiet moments, to the sound of his deep voice and the rare times she could make him smile. There was something restful about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel secure in a way she'd never experienced before. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, they were sitting on the porch when Kade unexpectedly brought up her mother. She used to sing, he said, seemingly out of nowhere. Your mother, I remember hearing her at church when I was a boy, had the prettiest voice in the county. Lillian smiled at the memory. Yes, she did. She sang all the time when she was cooking, sewing, even hanging laundry. Our cabin was never quiet when she was alive, and after, Kade asked gently, after she died, Lillian sighed. It was like all the music went with her. My father, he couldn't bear to hear singing anymore, said it reminded him too much of what he'd lost. Kade was quiet for a moment. Your father wasn't always the man he is now, he said finally. The drinking, the meanness that came later, after your mother passed. Lillian looked at him in surprise. You knew him before, our families were neighbors, remember? I was just a boy, but I recall him being different then. Hardworking, devoted to your mother. He shook his head. Grief changes some people, breaks something inside them that never heals right. Lillian thought about this, trying to reconcile the cruel, bitter man she knew with the husband her mother had loved. That doesn't excuse what he became, she said finally. No, Kade agreed. It doesn't. He looked out over the darkening valley, but understanding it might help you make peace with it someday. They sat in silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. Finally, Kade stood, stretching his tall frame. I should turn in. Morning comes early. Lillian nodded, rising as well. Good night, Mr. Mackenzie. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You could call me Kade, you know, when it's just us. The simple suggestion sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the summer evening. Good night, Kade, she said softly. He smiled, just a quick upturn of his lips. Good night, Lillian. As the summer days lengthened into July, Lillian settled into life at the ranch. Mrs. Donnelly proved to be a gruff but patient teacher, showing Lillian how to manage the household with efficient grace. Though the older woman rarely offered praise, Lillian could tell when she was pleased by the slight nod of approval that sometimes followed a well-executed task. One morning, as Lillian was gathering eggs from the henhouse, she heard the sound of approaching riders. Shading her eyes against the sun, she saw Kade and 2 of his men returning from the north pasture, driving a small herd of cattle ahead of them. She watched as they guided the animals into a pen near the barn, Kade's voice carrying across the yard as he called instructions to his men. There was something compelling about him in these moments, confident, authoritative, completely in his element. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, raising a hand in greeting. Lillian waved back, surprised by the flutter in her chest at this simple acknowledgement. Later that day, as she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, Kade approached, his hat in his hands. "Lillian," he said, nodding. "How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you." She pinned a shirt to the line, aware of his eyes on her. "Mrs. Donnelly is an excellent teacher. She speaks highly of you, says you're a quick study." Lillian glanced at him in surprise. "Mrs. Donnelly had never said anything of the sort to her face. Kade smiled at her expression. "She doesn't give praise easily, but when she does, she means it." He hesitated, then added, "I'm hosting a dinner next Saturday. The mayor of Silver Creek and his wife are coming, along with a few other important folks from town. I'd appreciate your help with the preparations." "Of course," Lillian said, though the thought of serving at a formal dinner for the town's elite made her nervous. "Whatever you need. Thank you." He seemed about to say something more, then changed his mind. "Well, I'll leave you to your work." As he walked away, Lillian found herself wondering about the man behind the composed exterior. What thoughts occupied him when he was alone? What dreams did he harbor for his ranch, for his future? Despite the growing ease between them, there was still so much about Kade Mackenzie that remained a mystery to her. The next few days were a flurry of preparation for the dinner party. Mrs. Donnelly was determined that the house should be spotless, the food perfect, and everything arranged to show the Mackenzie ranch at its best. "Mayor Fletcher's wife is a real stickler for propriety," she told Lillian as they polished the silver. "Always looking for something to criticize. Will not give her the satisfaction." By Saturday evening, the house was gleaming, the dining room set with the best china and crystal, and delicious aromas wafted from the kitchen where Mrs. Donnelly was putting the finishing touches on the meal. Lillian had just changed into her best dress, the new one she'd made from the calico she'd purchased in Silver Creek, when she heard the first carriage arriving. Peering out her window, she saw Kade striding across the yard to greet his guests, looking handsome in a dark suit and crisp white shirt. The sight of him so formally dressed caught her off guard. She was accustomed to seeing him in work clothes, with dust on his boots and his hat shadowing his face. This elegant, polished version of Kade was equally compelling, and Lillian found herself staring longer than was proper. Shaking herself out of her reverie, she hurried downstairs to help Mrs. Donnelly serve the arriving guests. The Fletchers were first, the mayor, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, his wife a thin woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. They were followed by the banker, Mr. Roberts, and his much younger wife, the owner of the Silver Creek Gazette, Mr. Harris. And finally, to Lillian's dismay, Sheriff Turner and his wife. She had been hoping to remain in the background, serving quietly and attracting little attention. But as she offered a tray of drinks in the parlor, the sheriff recognized her immediately. "Miss Grace," he said, nodding politely, "didn't expect to see you here." All eyes turned to Lillian, and she felt her cheeks warm under the scrutiny. "Miss Grace is my new housekeeper," Kade said smoothly, stepping forward. "Mrs. Donnelly isn't as young as she once was, and the house was becoming too much for her to manage alone. How fortunate for you to find such a position, Mrs. Fletcher said, her tone suggesting she found it anything but fortunate. "Especially after that unfortunate business with your father." Lillian's stomach tightened. "Excuse me, madam." "Oh, you mustn't mind me," Mrs. Fletcher said with a thin smile. "It's just that there was such talk in town after you left. Your poor father was quite distraught." "I'm sure he was," Kade interjected, his voice calm but with an edge of steel beneath it. "Hiram Grace has always been a man of strong emotions, especially after a few drinks." There was an awkward silence, broken by Mrs. Donnelly announcing that dinner was served. As the guests moved toward the dining room, Kade caught Lillian's eye, giving her a reassuring nod. The dinner itself went smoothly, with Lillian and Mrs. Donnelly serving each course efficiently. The conversation flowed around the table, touching on cattle prices, the progress of the railroad, and local politics. Lillian tried to remain invisible, focusing on her duties and avoiding Mrs. Fletcher's curious glances. It was as they were serving dessert Mrs. Donnelly's famous apple pie that the subject of Lillian's father arose again. I saw Hiram Grace in town last week, Mr. Harris commented, accepting a slice of pie from Lillian. Seemed to be in better spirits than when his daughter first left, said something about her coming to her senses soon. Lillian nearly dropped the pie server, saved only by Mrs. Donnelly's quick hand steadying hers. Is that so? Kade said, his tone casual though his eyes had hardened. Well, Miss Grace is employed here for as long as she wishes to stay. Her father's expectations are his own concern. Of course, Mr. Harris said hastily, seeming to realize he'd stepped into delicate territory. Just repeating what I heard, that's all. The conversation moved on to safer topics, but the damage was done. Lillian felt exposed, vulnerable, as if her father's shadow had somehow reached all the way to this table, reminding her that her newfound security might not be as complete as she'd hoped. After the guests departed, Lillian helped Mrs. Donnelly clear the table and wash the dishes, her mind still troubled by the evening's revelations. She was putting away the last of the crystal when Kade found her in the dining room. You did well tonight, he said quietly. Lillian glanced up at him. Thank you. I'm sorry about the awkwardness with the sheriff and Mrs. Fletcher. None of that was your fault. He leaned against the doorframe, studying her. But I'm concerned about what Harris said. If your father is still talking about you coming to your senses, he might not have given up on finding you. The thought sent a chill through her. What can I do? I can't hide forever. You're not hiding, Kade said firmly. You're living your life, working an honest job. There's no shame in that. Lillian nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. The weight of her father's expectations, his anger, still felt like a shadow hanging over her. I won't let him hurt you, Kade said, his voice low and intense. I promise you that, Lillian. The conviction in his words, the warmth in his eyes as they met hers, stirred something deep within her, a feeling she wasn't ready to name, but couldn't deny. In that moment, she knew she trusted him completely, this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly and changed it so profoundly. Thank you, she whispered, unable to find words adequate to express her gratitude. He nodded, holding her gaze a moment longer before turning away. Get some rest, it's been a long day. As July gave way to August, the days grew hotter, the work on the ranch more demanding. Kade and his men were often gone from dawn to dusk, moving cattle to fresh pastures, repairing fences damaged by summer storms, and preparing for the autumn roundup. Lillian settled into a comfortable routine with Mrs. Donnelly, the two women working together with increasing harmony as Lillian learned the older woman's ways. They baked bread in the cool morning hours, preserved summer fruits and vegetables for the winter ahead, and kept the house running smoothly despite the constant traffic of dusty cowboys tracking in and out. One particularly hot afternoon, Mrs. Donnelly announced she was going to lie down for a bit. This heat's hard on my old bones, she said, wiping her brow. Mind finishing up the ironing for me? Of course not, Lillian assured her. You rest. Left alone in the kitchen, Lillian continued pressing Kade's shirts, taking care with each one. As she worked, she hummed softly to herself an old lullaby her mother used to sing. Lost in the task and the melody, she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a voice spoke from the doorway. You have your mother's voice, Lillian started, nearly scorching one of the shirts. Kade stood watching her, his expression gentle. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to startle you. It's all right. She set the iron aside, embarrassed to have been caught singing. I didn't realize anyone was listening. Don't stop on my account, he said, entering the kitchen. It's nice to hear music in the house again. Reminds me of when my mother was alive. Lillian glanced up at him. When did she pass? 10 years ago now. He leaned against the counter, his eyes distant with memory. Consumption, same as your mother, I believe. Lillian nodded. It was a bad year for fevers. Half the county fell ill. I remember. He was quiet for a moment, then seemed to shake off the melancholy. I came to tell you I'm riding into Silver Creek tomorrow. Thought you might want to come along, pick up any supplies you or Mrs. Donnelly need. The offer surprised her. Are you sure that's wise? With my father still in town. He won't bother you, Kade said with quiet confidence. Not while you're with me. There was something in the way he said it, a protectiveness, a certainty that made Lillian's heart beat a little faster. She found herself nodding. "All right, thank you." The ride to Silver Creek the next day was pleasant, the morning cool enough to make the journey comfortable. Kade pointed out landmarks along the way, telling her stories about the early days of the territory. Lillian found herself laughing at his dry humor, relaxing in his company in a way she'd never expected when she first agreed to work for him. As they approached the town, however, her anxiety returned. She hadn't set foot in Silver Creek since the day she'd left with Kade, and the thought of possibly encountering her father made her stomach clench with dread. Kade seemed to sense her unease. "We'll stop at the general store first," he said. "Then the bank. You won't have to walk around town alone." True to his word, he stayed by her side as they moved from store to store, collecting the supplies on Mrs. Donnelly's list. People greeted Kade respectfully, eyeing Lillian with curiosity but saying nothing directly to her. It was as they were leaving the bank that Lillian spotted her father. He was coming out of the saloon across the street, wobbling slightly. For a moment she froze, her hand tightening on the package she was carrying. Kade followed her gaze, his expression hardening when he saw Hiram Grace. "Let's go," he said quietly, placing a hand at the small of her back to guide her toward where their horses were hitched, but it was too late. Her father had seen them. "Lillian," he called, his voice slurred but loud enough to carry across the street. "Girl, you get over here." Lillian kept walking, her heart hammering in her chest. Kade's hand remained steady at her back, a reassuring pressure. "Don't you walk away from me," Hiram shouted, stumbling into the street. "I'm talking to you, girl." People were stopping to stare now, the commotion drawing attention from up and down the street. Lillian felt herself shrinking under the scrutiny, the old fear rising in her throat, and then Kade was stepping in front of her, his tall figure blocking her father from view. "That's enough, Hiram," he said, his voice carrying clearly though he didn't shout. "Miss Grace is employed at my ranch now. She's not going anywhere with you." "She's my daughter," Hiram snarled, coming closer. Lillian could smell the whiskey on him even from several feet away. "I've got rights." "She's a grown woman making her own choices," Kade replied, his tone firm but controlled. "And she's chosen not to return to your home. I suggest you respect that decision." Hiram's face contorted with rage. "You think you're better than me, don't you, Mackenzie? Always have. Well, you ain't. And you got no right to take my girl." "I didn't take her," Kade said evenly. "I offered her a job when she needed one, that's all." "That's all, is it?" Hiram's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "Then why you keeping her at your place, a pretty young thing like that living under your roof?" "People are talking, Mackenzie." Lillian felt her face burn with shame at the implication. Beside her, she felt Kade tense, though his expression remained impassive. "Mrs. Donnelly lives at the ranch as well, as you well know," he said, his voice dangerously quiet now. "Lillian's reputation is untarnished. The only one damaging it right now is you, making a scene in the middle of town." By now, a small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Lillian wanted nothing more than to disappear, to be anywhere but here, the center of this humiliating spectacle. Hiram took another unsteady step forward, his face flushed with drink and anger. "You always thought you were too good for the rest of us with your big ranch and your fancy house. But I know what you're after. Same thing any man wants from a pretty girl." Before Kade could respond, Sheriff Turner appeared, pushing through the crowd. "That's enough, Hiram," he said firmly. "You're drunk and causing a disturbance. Time to go home." "I ain't going nowhere till I get my daughter back," Hiram insisted, his voice rising. The sheriff sighed, then gestured to two men standing nearby. "Take Mr. Grace to the jail to sleep it off." He turned to Kade and Lillian. "You folks might want to head on back to the ranch. This isn't going to get any better until he sobers up." Kade nodded, his hand returning to the small of Lillian's back as he guided her toward their horses. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go home." The ride back to the ranch was silent, Lillian too mortified by the scene in town to speak. Kade seemed lost in his own thoughts, his expression grim as they rode side by side through the afternoon heat. It wasn't until they reached the ranch, the horses stabled and the supplies unloaded, that he finally spoke. "I'm sorry about that," he said as they stood in the yard. "I shouldn't have suggested you come to town." Lillian shook her head. "It's not your fault. My father would have caused trouble eventually, whether I was there or not. Still," he looked troubled, "what he implied about you staying at the ranch." "People will talk," Lillian said, trying to sound unconcerned though the memory of her father's accusations still stung. "They always do." Kade was quiet for a moment, studying her. "Does it bother you, what people might think?" Lillian considered the question. Did it bother her that people might believe she was more to Kade than just his housekeeper? The truth was, in the weeks she'd been at the ranch, her feelings for him had grown into something she scarcely dared acknowledge, even to herself. There were moments like now, with his eyes on hers, concerned and searching when she thought there might be something more on his side as well. But those were dangerous thoughts, leading to impossible hopes. "I care more about the truth than rumors," she said finally. "And the truth is, you've been nothing but honorable and kind. You gave me a job when I needed one, a safe place to live. I'm grateful for that, not ashamed of it." Something flickered in his eyes, relief perhaps, or something more complex. "Thank you for saying that," he said quietly. "But if you ever feel uncomfortable here, for any reason, I hope you'll tell me." "I will," she promised, though she couldn't imagine ever wanting to leave the safety and peace she'd found at the Mackenzie ranch. That evening, after supper, Kade invited Lillian to join him on the porch, as had become their custom. The sun was setting, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink, a cool breeze stirring the air after the heat of the day. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the colors fade from the sky. Finally, Kade spoke. "I've been thinking about what your father said today." Lillian tensed. "Oh, about people talking." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I don't want your reputation compromised because of your association with me. It's not fair to you." "I told you I don't care about gossip," Lillian said, though she wondered where this conversation was leading. Kade nodded. "I know, but I care about your future, your good name." He hesitated, then continued. "Which is why I've been thinking about asking Mrs. Donnelly's niece to come stay with us as well. She's a widow, about your age. Having another young woman in the house might quiet some of the talk." Lillian felt a pang of disappointment, though she couldn't have explained why. "If you think that's best," she said carefully. He studied her for a moment. "You don't sound convinced." "It's not my place to have an opinion on how you run your household," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "I'm asking for your opinion," Kade said quietly. "I value it." Lillian looked away, struggling to sort through her complicated feelings. "I suppose I'm concerned that bringing someone else in might change things." She glanced back at him. "Mrs. Donnelly and I have found a good rhythm." "And you and I—" She trailed off, unsure how to express what she meant without revealing too much. "You and I," Kade prompted, his voice gentle. Lillian took a deep breath. "We've become friends, I think. I'd hate to lose that ease between us." Kade was silent for a long moment, his eyes on the darkening valley. "Friends," he repeated finally, as if testing the word. "Yes, I suppose we have." Something in his tone made Lillian wonder if she'd said the wrong thing, if perhaps friends wasn't the word he would have chosen. But before she could ask, he stood, stretching his tall frame. "It's getting late. We should turn in." As he held the door for her, their eyes met briefly, and Lillian thought she saw something unspoken in his gaze, a question, perhaps, or a regret. But it was gone before she could be sure, and they parted ways in the hallway with nothing more than a quiet good night. August gave way to September, bringing cooler nights and the first hints of autumn color to the valley. The ranch grew busy with preparations for the fall roundup, when the cattle would be gathered, counted, and the calves separated for branding or sale. Lillian found herself caught up in the excitement, helping Mrs. Donnelly prepare extra food for the cowboys who would be working from dawn to dusk. The bunkhouse, usually home to just a handful of permanent hands, would soon be filled with seasonal workers hired for the roundup. "It's always a busy time," Mrs. Donnelly explained as they kneaded bread dough side by side, "but it's good for the ranch." A successful roundup means a comfortable winter for everyone. Kade was increasingly absent, riding out early and returning late, often too tired for their evening conversations on the porch. Lillian missed those quiet moments more than she cared to admit, though she understood the demands of the season. One evening, as she was hanging the last of the laundry before sunset, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw a rider coming fast down the road to the ranch, not Kade or any of his regular hands, but a young boy she recognized as the son of a neighboring rancher. He reined in his horse in a cloud of dust, looking around frantically until he spotted Lillian. "Miss Grace," he called. "Is the boss here?" "No, he's out checking the north pasture," Lillian said, alarmed by the boy's urgency. "What's wrong?" "Fire," the boy gasped. "Lightning struck over by Crooked Creek. The grass is burning, heading this way." Lillian's heart lurched. Prairie fires were one of the greatest dangers in this dry country, capable of destroying everything in their path. "Where's Mrs. Donnelly?" she asked, already moving toward the house. "Gone to visit her sister in town," the boy replied. "Left this morning." That meant Lillian was alone at the ranch house with a fire approaching and no way to reach Kade. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. "Ride to the north pasture," she instructed the boy. "Find Mr. Mackenzie and his men, tell them what's happening." The boy nodded and wheeled his horse around, galloping off in the direction Kade had gone earlier that day. Lillian hurried to the barn, where she knew the ranch kept equipment for fighting fires. She'd need to soak gunny sacks in water, prepare buckets, and clear as much of the area around the house as possible. For the next hour, she worked frantically, her fear driving her to move faster than she'd ever thought possible. She dragged water from the well to fill every available container, soaked the gunny sacks, and used a rake to clear dead grass from around the buildings. As the sun began to set, she could see the glow on the horizon, an ominous orange light that meant the fire was getting closer. Smoke scented the air, growing thicker by the minute. Still, there was no sign of Kade or his men. Lillian knew she had to make a decision. The ranch house contained everything Kade's family had built over generations. She couldn't just abandon it to the flames. But if the fire reached the buildings before help arrived, she'd be in serious danger. The sound of approaching riders made her heart leap with hope, but it wasn't Kade. Instead, 3 men from a neighboring ranch rode into the yard, their faces grim. "Miss Grace," one called. "Boyd sent us to help. The boss and his men are trying to cut a fire break on the east side, but they might not make it back in time." Relief flooded through her. "Thank you, I've prepared what I could." The men dismounted quickly, taking in her preparations with approving nods. "You've done well," the leader said. "Now let's see if we can save this place." For the next 2 hours, Lillian worked alongside the men, her dress stained with soot, her hands blistered from the rough gunny sacks. They wet down the roofs of the buildings, cleared more space around the structures, and prepared to fight the advancing flames. The fire crested the nearest hill just as full darkness fell, a terrifying wall of orange and red against the night sky. The heat was intense even from a distance, the roar of the flames like some great beast bearing down on them. "It's coming too fast," one of the men shouted. "We need to get out of here." But Lillian couldn't bear the thought of abandoning the house that had become her home. "No," she cried. "We can save it. The wind's shifting. Look," she was right. The wind, which had been driving the fire directly toward the ranch, was beginning to change direction, pushing the flames to the south. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to spare the main buildings if they could control the edge of the fire closest to them. With renewed determination, they attacked the advancing flames, beating them back with the wet gunny sacks, creating a barrier the fire couldn't cross. Lillian worked until her arms felt like lead, her lungs burning from the smoke, her eyes stinging with tears and ash. And then, suddenly, there were more men around her. Kade and his ranch hands, their faces blackened with soot, their eyes wide with fear and determination. Kade himself appeared at her side, taking the heavy sack from her hands. "Lillian, you need to get to safety." "I'm not leaving," she said firmly, reaching for another sack. "This is my home too." Something flashed in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or something deeper. But there was no time to analyze it as the fire surged closer, driven by a sudden gust of wind. For what seemed like hours, they fought the flames together, a desperate battle against nature's fury. And slowly, incredibly, they began to win. The fire line held, the flames gradually receding as the wind continued to shift and the firefighters gained ground. By midnight, the immediate danger had passed. The fire was still burning to the south, but it was moving away from the ranch, leaving behind a swath of blackened earth but sparing the buildings. Exhausted, smoke-stained, and weary beyond words, Lillian sank onto the porch steps. Kade sat beside her, passing her a canteen of water. She drank gratefully, her throat raw from the smoke. "You saved the ranch," he said quietly, his voice rough. "Boyd told me how you organized everything before we could get here. If you hadn't acted so quickly." Lillian shook her head. "I just did what needed doing." Kade looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "No," he said, "you did more than that. You fought for this place like it was your own." "It feels like home," she admitted softly, "more than anywhere else ever has." Something changed in his expression, then a softening, a decision made. He reached out, gently brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek. "It is your home," he said, "for as long as you want it to be." The touch of his fingers against her skin sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the lingering heat of the fire. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Lillian knew that whatever was between them had shifted, deepened into something neither of them could ignore any longer. But before either could speak, one of the ranch hands called for Kade's attention. There was still work to be done, fires to be watched, men to be organized. The moment broke, but the memory of it, the promise of it, stayed with Lillian as she finally made her way to her room in the early hours of the morning. The aftermath of the fire kept everyone busy for days. Fields had to be assessed for damage, fences repaired, and cattle rounded up from where they had scattered in panic. The roundup, originally scheduled to begin the following week, had to be moved up to account for the disruption. Lillian and Mrs. Donnelly, who had returned from town the day after the fire, worked tirelessly to feed the extra hands who had come to help with the recovery efforts. The kitchen was constantly busy, the dining room filled at all hours with hungry men. Kade was everywhere at once, directing the work, checking on his land, consulting with neighboring ranchers about the extent of the damage. He and Lillian barely had time to exchange more than a few words in passing, though each time their eyes met, she felt that same connection, that unspoken understanding. It was nearly a week before things began to return to something approaching normal. The roundup was in full swing, but the immediate crisis had passed. One evening, Lillian was sitting alone on the porch, enjoying a rare moment of quiet when Kade joined her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the chair beside hers. "Please," she said, secretly pleased to have his company after so many days of distant exchanges. He settled beside her with a weary sigh, stretching his long legs out in front of him. For a while they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky. "I never properly thanked you," Kade said finally. "For what you did during the fire." Lillian shook her head. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said firmly, "not anyone. Most people would have fled, and rightly so, but you stayed, you fought for this place." He turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Why?" Lillian considered the question, searching for an answer that was true but not too revealing. "Because it matters to you," she said finally, "and you matter to me." The words hung between them, more honest than she'd intended. Kade was quiet for a long moment, and Lillian feared she'd said too much, crossed some invisible line in their carefully maintained relationship. Then he reached over and took her hand in his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "You matter to me too, Lillian, more than I can say." Her heart quickened at his touch, at the quiet intensity in his voice. "Kade, I've been wanting to tell you," he continued, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand. "For weeks now. But I didn't want to presume or to make you uncomfortable in any way." "You could never make me uncomfortable," Lillian said softly. He smiled at that, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Even when I'm being a stubborn rancher," she laughed, the tension easing between them. "Well, perhaps occasionally." His expression grew serious again. Lillian, I need to be honest with you about why I brought you here. She tensed slightly. You said it was because Mrs. Donnelly needed help. That was part of it, he acknowledged, but not all of it. He took a deep breath. I've known who you were since you were a child, your mother. She did something for me once, something I never forgot. When I heard you were working at the boarding house trying to escape your father, I felt like I was being given a chance to repay that debt. Lillian frowned, confused. What did my mother do? Cade's eyes grew distant with memory. I was 16. My father had just died and I was angry at the world. I started drinking, getting into fights. One night, I was in a bad way drunk, hurt from a brawl. I ended up collapsed on the road near your parents' cabin. Your mother found me, took me in, cleaned me up. She could have just sent for my family or left me there. I was nothing to her, but she showed me kindness when I didn't deserve it. He looked back at Lillian, his eyes intense. She talked to me that night. Told me that grief was natural, but that destroying myself wouldn't honor my father's memory. Said I had a choice to make about the kind of man I wanted to be. He squeezed her hand gently. I made my choice that night because of her, went home, sobered up, took on the responsibility of the ranch. Everything I've built since then, I owe in part to your mother's kindness to a foolish boy. Lillian was silent, absorbing this revelation. It explained so much his initial interest in her, his protective attitude, his knowledge of her family. So you offered me a job out of gratitude to my mother, she said finally, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. At first, Kate admitted, but Lillian. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. What I feel for you now has nothing to do with the past. It's about who you are, your strength, your kindness, your determination. The way you've made this house feel like a home again, the way you smile when you think no one is watching, the way you sing when you work. Her heart was pounding now, hope rising within her like a tide. What are you saying, Kade? I'm saying I've fallen in love with you, he said simply. And if you don't feel the same way, I'll understand. Nothing has to change. You'll always have a place here regardless. For a moment, Lillian couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his eyes, the words she'd hardly dared to hope for. Then, slowly, she smiled. I think I've been falling in love with you since the day you stood up for me in the boarding house, she confessed. I just never imagined you might feel the same way. The smile that broke across his face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. Still holding her hands, he stood, drawing her to her feet with him. Lillian Grace, he said softly. May I kiss you? She nodded, her heart too full for words. Kade released her hands only to cup her face gently, his touch reverent as he tilted her face up to his. And then his lips were on hers, warm and tender, and Lillian felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The kiss was everything she had ever dreamed a first kiss should be: sweet, gentle, and full of promise. When they finally parted, Kade rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if savoring the moment. I've wanted to do that for a very long time, he murmured. Lillian smiled. I'm glad you finally did, he chuckled, drawing back slightly to look into her eyes. Does this mean you'll consider staying, not as my housekeeper, but as what? She prompted when he hesitated. Kade took a deep breath. As my wife, if you'll have me. Lillian stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. Are you proposing? Not very well, it seems, he said with a rueful smile. I should be on one knee with a ring and pretty words prepared. I don't need any of that, Lillian said quickly. Just you. The tenderness in his expression made her heart ache with joy. You have me, he promised, for as long as you want me. Then yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you, Kade Mackenzie. He kissed her again, this time with more passion, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her close against him. Lillian melted into his embrace, feeling as though she had finally, truly come home. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch and the surrounding community. Mrs. Donnelly, to Lillian's surprise, seemed genuinely pleased. About time, she said gruffly when they told her. Been watching you two dance around each other for months now. The hands were equally supportive, though some teased Kade good-naturedly about finally getting hitched. The neighboring ranchers and their wives called to offer congratulations, and even the townspeople of Silver Creek, once they got over their initial surprise, seemed to accept the match as fitting. Only Hiram Grace remained a shadow on their happiness. Though he had been quiet since the confrontation in town, Lillian worried about how he would react to the news of her engagement. "He can't hurt you," Kade assured her when she voiced her concerns. "Not anymore." "It's not me I'm worried about," Lillian admitted. "He has a temper, especially when he's been drinking. I don't want him causing trouble for you." Kade's expression softened. "Always thinking of others," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "But you don't need to worry about me. I can handle Hiram Grace." They set the wedding date for October, after the roundup was completed and before the winter weather set in. It would be a simple ceremony at the ranch, with only close friends and neighbors in attendance. Mrs. Donnelly and several of the neighboring women helped Lillian prepare her wedding dress, a beautiful creation of ivory satin with lace at the collar and cuffs. As she stood for the final fitting, looking at herself in the mirror, Lillian could scarcely believe the transformation in her life. Less than 6 months ago, she had been fleeing her father's cabin with nothing but a bundle of clothes and a few coins to her name. Now she was about to become the wife of the most respected rancher in the territory, mistress of a beautiful home, and most importantly, deeply, truly loved. 2 weeks before the wedding, Kade had to ride into Silver Creek on business. "I'll be back by nightfall," he promised, kissing Lillian goodbye, "and I might have a surprise for you." She smiled, curious but content to wait. "Be safe." The day passed pleasantly enough, Lillian and Mrs. Donnelly occupied with preparations for the wedding feast. By mid-afternoon, however, Lillian began to feel uneasy. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising a fierce storm. She found herself glancing repeatedly out the window, hoping to see Kade returning before the weather broke. When the first heavy drops began to fall, she moved to the porch, peering anxiously down the road. The storm hit with sudden fury, lightning flashing across the sky, thunder shaking the house, and rain falling in sheets that obscured her view beyond a few yards. "He'll have taken shelter somewhere," Mrs. Donnelly said, joining her at the window. "Kade's got more sense than to ride in this." Lillian nodded, though her worry persisted. "You're right, I'm sure he's fine." But as the afternoon wore into evening with no sign of Kade, her concern deepened. The storm showed no signs of abating, the wind howling around the house and rain lashing against the windows. By the time darkness fell, Lillian was pacing the floor, unable to hide her anxiety. "Something's wrong," she said to Mrs. Donnelly. "He should have been back by now, storm or no storm." The older woman's face betrayed her own worry, though she tried to sound reassuring. "The creek might be high. He could be waiting for it to go down before trying to cross." Just as Lillian was considering asking some of the hands to form a search party, despite the dangerous conditions, they heard the sound of horses approaching. She rushed to the door, flinging it open to see Kade dismounting in the yard, soaked to the skin but blessedly alive and unharmed. "Kade." She cried, relief flooding through her. She ran out into the rain, heedless of the downpour, and threw herself into his arms. He held her tightly, his wet clothes immediately soaking hers. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her hair. "I didn't mean to worry you." "I thought something had happened," she said, drawing back to look at him. Rain streamed down his face, plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "Nothing serious," he assured her. "The creek was running high, so I had to take the long way around, and I had a situation to deal with in town." There was something in his tone that made her pause. "What kind of situation?" Kade glanced over her shoulder to where Mrs. Donnelly stood in the doorway. "Let's get inside first. We're both getting soaked." Once they were in the house, dry clothes donned and hot coffee in hand, Kade explained what had delayed him. "Your father was in town," he said, his expression grim. "He'd heard about our engagement and was making threats, said he wouldn't allow his daughter to marry me." Lillian's stomach clenched with dread. "What happened?" "I tried to reason with him first," Kade said. "Offered him money to leave the territory, start fresh somewhere else. He refused." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes troubled. "Then he drew on me," Lillian gasped. "He tried to shoot you." "He was drunk, angry, not thinking clearly." Kade's voice was calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "The sheriff was there, thankfully, disarmed him before anyone got hurt." "Is he in jail?" Lillian asked, her voice small. Kade nodded. "For now." Sheriff says he'll keep him there until after the wedding, then strongly suggest he move on. He reached across the table to take her hand. I'm sorry, Lillian, I know he's still your father. She squeezed his hand, tears pricking her eyes. He stopped being a father to me a long time ago. I'm just grateful you weren't hurt, he smiled gently. It takes more than Hiram Grace to keep me from coming home to you. Then, as if remembering something, he reached into his pocket. I almost forgot, I have something for you. He pulled out a small velvet box, slightly damp from the rain. Opening it, he revealed a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. I ordered it from Denver weeks ago. It finally arrived today. Lillian stared at the ring, then at Kade, her heart so full she thought it might burst. It's beautiful, she whispered. Not as beautiful as you, he said, sliding the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the lamplight as she moved her hand. Now it's official, no backing out, she laughed, joy bubbling up despite the lingering worry about her father, as if I would want to. The day of the wedding dawned clear and cool, the mountains to the west capped with fresh snow from the recent storms. The ranch was abuzz with activity from early morning tables being set up in the yard, flowers arranged in the house, and the delicious smells of the wedding feast filling the air. Lillian spent the morning in her room, Mrs. Donnelly and several other women helping her prepare. As she stood in her wedding dress, her mother's locket around her neck and her hair arranged in soft curls, she felt a momentary pang that her mother couldn't be there to see this day. She would be so proud of you, Mrs. Donnelly said, as if reading her thoughts. The older woman's eyes were suspiciously bright as she adjusted Lillian's veil. You look beautiful, child. Thank you, Lillian said softly. For everything, you've been like family to me, Mrs. Donnelly sniffed, blinking rapidly. Well, now I am family, or will be in about an hour. She patted Lillian's cheek. Kade's a good man, the best I know, you'll be happy together. The ceremony itself was simple but moving, held in the parlor of the ranch house with the minister from Silver Creek officiating. Kade waited for her at the front of the room, his eyes never leaving hers as she walked toward him on the arm of his foreman, who had offered to give her away. As they exchanged their vows, Lillian felt a sense of rightness, of completion, that she had never experienced before. This was where she belonged with this man, in this house, surrounded by people who had become her family by choice rather than by blood. The celebration afterward was joyful, with music and dancing and more food than even the hungry ranch hands could consume. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the yard, Kade found Lillian sitting on the porch, taking a moment's respite from the festivities. Happy, Mrs. Mackenzie, he asked, sitting beside her and taking her hand in his. The new name sent a thrill through her. Very happy, Mr. Mackenzie, she replied, leaning against his shoulder. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I have one more surprise for you. Another one, she smiled up at him. You've already given me more than I ever dreamed possible. This one's a bit different, he said, his expression slightly nervous. I hope you'll approve. Before she could ask what he meant, she noticed a figure approaching from the direction of the barn, a man she didn't recognize at first, until he came closer and she saw his face clearly in the fading light. Father, she gasped, rising to her feet. Hiram Grace stood before her, clean-shaven and sober, wearing what appeared to be a new suit. He looked older than she remembered and somehow smaller, less threatening. Lillian, he said, his voice rough with emotion, you look just like your mother. She felt Kade's hand at the small of her back, a silent support. What are you doing here? She asked, unable to keep the wariness from her voice. Mackenzie came to see me, Hiram said, glancing at Kade. In jail, said I could come to the wedding if I sobered up. Said maybe it was time to make peace. Lillian turned to Kade in surprise. He hadn't mentioned visiting her father again. You did that? Kade nodded, his eyes serious. It should be your choice whether to see him or not. I just thought, it's your wedding day. If there was ever a time for new beginnings. She felt a rush of love for this man who understood without her having to explain that despite everything, a part of her still yearned for reconciliation with her father. Turning back to Hiram, she studied him carefully. Are you sober? He nodded. Month now. After they let me out of jail, I went to stay with Pastor Wilson. He's been helping me. He shifted uncomfortably, then added, I'm leaving tomorrow. Got a job with a freight company in Helena. Thought maybe it would be good to say goodbye properly this time. Lillian felt tears welling in her eyes. This wasn't the angry, bitter man who had called her a burden all her life. This was someone trying, however imperfectly, to make amends. I'm glad you came, she said softly. Hiram's eyes brightened with cautious hope. Yeah, she nodded. Would you like something to eat? There's plenty. I'd like that, he said. Then, with visible effort, he turned to Kade. Thank you for giving me this chance and for, he glanced at Lillian, for seeing what I couldn't, that she's a blessing, not a burden. Kade's arm slipped around Lillian's waist, drawing her close to his side. She is the greatest blessing of my life, he said simply, and I intend to make sure she never doubts it. As they rejoined the celebration, Lillian's heart felt lighter than it had in years. She had no illusions that one day could heal all the wounds of her childhood, or that her father would suddenly become the parent she had always wanted. But it was a beginning, a chance to let go of the pain of the past and embrace the joy of her present, and what a joy it was. Looking around at the gathering, Mrs. Donnelly bossing the kitchen helpers, the ranch hands dancing with local girls, neighbors and friends sharing stories and laughter, Lillian felt a sense of belonging she had never known before. This was her family now, her community, her home. Later that night, as she and Kade stood alone on the porch after the last guests had departed, she turned to him with wonder in her eyes. How did you know, she asked, that I needed to make peace with my father even after everything? Kade brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. Because I know you, he said simply. Your heart is too generous to hold on to bitterness even when it would be justified. She leaned into his touch. Thank you for understanding, for everything, he smiled, drawing her closer. You never have to thank me for loving you, Lillian. It's as natural as breathing. His lips found hers in a tender kiss. Welcome home, Mrs. Mackenzie. And as she melted into his embrace, Lillian knew that she had indeed come home, not just to this ranch, this house, but to this man who saw her not as a burden, but as the blessing she had always longed to be. 5 years later, Lillian stood on the porch of the Mackenzie ranch, watching as her husband rode in from the north pasture, their 3-year-old son, James, perched in front of him on the saddle. The little boy was laughing, his dark hair so like his father's ruffled by the wind, his small hands gripping the saddle horn with determined strength. Behind them came their foreman, leading a string of horses, and among the ranch hands, Lillian spotted a familiar figure, her father, his face weathered but clear-eyed, sober now for 5 years and counting. After that first tentative reconciliation at their wedding, Hiram Grace had indeed gone to Helena as planned. But a year later he had returned, hat in hand, asking for a chance to be part of his daughter's life. And somewhat to Lillian's surprise, Kade had offered him a job on the ranch. He's a good hand with horses, Kade had said when she questioned his decision, and everyone deserves a second chance. It hadn't been easy. There had been difficult conversations, old wounds reopened before they could truly heal. But slowly, painfully, Lillian and her father had built a new relationship, not the one she had longed for as a child, but one based on mutual respect and the shared love of her children. For James had been joined, just 6 months ago, by a baby sister they had named Sarah, after Lillian's mother. The infant was inside now, napping under Mrs. Donnelly's watchful eye. The older woman had refused all talk of retirement, insisting that she intended to help raise the Mackenzie children just as she had helped raise Kade himself. As Kade reined in his horse in front of the house, he lifted James down, the boy immediately running to Lillian with excited tales of the day's adventures. Kade dismounted more slowly, passing the reins to one of the hands before joining his wife and son on the porch. Mama. Papa showed me the new foals, James exclaimed, his small face alight with enthusiasm. Can I have one when I'm bigger? Papa said maybe when I'm 5, Lillian laughed, ruffling her son's hair. Did he now? Well, we'll see about that. She looked up at Kade, who was watching them with undisguised love in his eyes. Good day. Better now, he said, leaning down to kiss her softly. Even after 5 years of marriage, his touch still sent a thrill through her. How's Sarah? just gone down for her nap. She's been fussy all morning. I think she's cutting another tooth. Kade nodded sympathetically. Poor little thing, and how are you? Not too tired? The concern in his voice warmed her heart. He had been this way through both her pregnancies, attentive, protective, insisting she rest whenever possible despite her protests that pregnancy wasn't an illness. I'm fine, she assured him. Though I could use some help with the garden later. The beans are coming in faster than I can pick them. I'm your man, he said with a smile. Then, to James, why don't you go see if Mrs. Donnelly needs help with those cookies she was baking? Tell her Papa said it's very important work. The boy nodded solemnly and dashed inside, leaving his parents alone on the porch. Kade drew Lillian into his arms, holding her close against his chest. I missed you today, he murmured against her hair. She smiled, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and horses, and the sage that grew wild on the prairie. You were only gone a few hours. Too long, he said, his voice deepening as he tilted her face up for another kiss, this one lingering and full of promise. When they finally parted, Lillian rested her head against his chest, content in the circle of his arms. I love you, Kade Mackenzie. And I love you, Lillian Mackenzie. His hand stroked gently down her back. Every day, more than the day before. From inside the house came the sound of their son's laughter, mingling with Mrs. Donnelly's voice and the fainter cry of baby Sarah awakening from her nap. Life at the Mackenzie ranch was seldom quiet, rarely without its challenges, but always filled with love. As Lillian and Kade went inside to join their family, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a frightened girl fleeing her father's cruelty to a confident woman surrounded by love. The path hadn't always been smooth, but every step had led her home. And as she watched Kade lift their daughter from her cradle, his strong hands so gentle with the tiny infant, she knew that the words he had spoken on their wedding day remained true. She was indeed the greatest blessing of his life, just as he and their children were the greatest blessings of hers. Her father had called her a burden, but the cowboy had called her a blessing and had never left her side. And in doing so, he had shown her the truth of who she was, and who she could be, not through grand gestures or elaborate declarations, but through the steadfast love of each ordinary day. It was, Lillian thought as she joined her family at the table, the most extraordinary gift of all.